The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept it, and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is May 6th, 2024, and the second day of Sesshin here at Mountain Gate. The significance of this day is it's 20 years since Roshi Kapleau passed on. And here, his teaching is being continued, which says a lot about the quality of his teaching and the power of his teaching. Roshi died peacefully, surrounded by his Sangha, with his daughter there also, in the garden at Rochester Zen Center. He always loved the sun. He was a Leo, and I think I mentioned in a teisho previously that the folks in the Mexican Sangha called him a lizard because he would wrap himself up in a blanket and sit in the sun. He did end up with a little divot of the removal of a skin cancer in his nose, but in general, he really didn't have any other signs of sickness with that. He did get amoebic dysentery. He had spent so long in Mexico, so many years in Mexico. In the early years of Rochester, as was typical in Soto Zen at the time in Japan, there were 3 months of teaching by the teacher, by the Roshi, and then 3 months off, and then 3 more months on, and then 3 more months off. And so it was that we had 7-day sessions when Roshi was in-house at Rochester, and 4-day sessions in the months when he was not 4-day sessions, and those days being led by his senior students. They were not allowed to give doksan or even daisan back then. There were still more years of training before they could do that. But that's how it worked. In some ways, it was an effective way, at least in terms of those years in practice, because there was the big push in the 3 months that he was there to really go deep in our practice, and then 3 months of processing. But the 3 months of processing seemed to take a little longer time from deepening practice. I'm not quite sure why, other than in so many cases, a Sangha depends, when it shouldn't, on the teacher. Depends on the teacher to really do their practice for them. It's not appropriate. At Hidden Valley Zen Center, when I first took over there, the previous teacher, who had died between when I met her and when I went back to take over the center and do a whole sesshin, had somehow given the Sangha the impression that she was the only one that could convey awakening on them. And they would come into Sanzen and sort of sit there and wait for me to wave my magic wand. It's not ever going to happen like that. And many of those people just dropped away. Roshi Kapleau, I've gotten more and more and more impressed with his teaching and his demeanor and his commitment to the teaching over the years. When he first came to the United States after his long training in Japan, he settled in Rochester because it was such a grim place to live. It had nasty weather. In the winter, there was a lake effect snow. In the mid-70s, it actually the snow went all the way up to the roof of the covered walkway. In the summer, it was blasted hot and incredibly moisture. You would drip. The seatings in the zendo, all of which were zafus on zabutons, nobody sat in a chair. It was sort of considered both cheating and is simply unavailable. Roshi had to, when he went to Japan to train at Hoshinji, which was after he'd been 3 months with Nakagawa Soen Roshi, there were no chairs in Japan. People sat on their knees on the floor, a tatami floor. That was the way they'd sat for centuries. There was almost no furniture in a Japanese house. There was something called a kotatsu, which was a low table that was basically at the height you would find convenient if you were on your knees. And I don't mean standing on your knees. I mean sitting on your haunches. And I think this is why, it's said anyway, this is why the Japanese people for a long time, their body proportions were not similar to Western proportions, because apparently the blood was limited in how it could get down below our knees. And so the legs were less long than one would expect if one were a Westerner. That has changed now, because these days Japanese have chairs, tables, beds, and so on, just like Western homes. They usually have one room in their house, particularly if they're middle class or upper, which has a tatami floor. But otherwise, it's all wood floors, and it's so they don't have to sit on their knees very often. When I was doing calligraphy studies with my 2 calligraphy teachers in Japan, one of whom was a provincial treasurer, we were sitting on our knees at one of those low tables on the tatami. Although these days, most Japanese cannot really sit straight on the tatami. It's actually quite hard. It's not soft at all. And not only that, but it's textured so that if you're sitting on your knees and shins, it is quite painful unless you get used to it. So they have come up with small zabutons. Those are the flat mats that one can sit on even when you're in front of the kotatsu. The kotatsu traditionally had a charcoal brazier beneath it. There was a pit, and in the winter, the kotatsu was brought out and set over the pit so that there was a nice warmth underneath it. And they also had a kind of a comforter that would fit over the top of the table, which then would be topped with glass for protection, and you would just wrap it over your lower leg, or your upper legs, I guess, as you're sitting at the kotatsu. Nowadays, there's no charcoal brazier down there because it's been discovered that, in fact, that's considered to be one way to commit suicide, is to be enclosed in a room with charcoal. There has been a spate of deaths in other countries where people are having their charcoal brazier out on their balcony, but the balcony is overhung, and so there's still enough of the poisonous gas that comes out of charcoal that people die. But anyway, it's now an electric I don't know what you call it, electric grill, but anyway, you turn it on with a switch and it gets nice and warm down there. The Japanese are quite excellent at spot heat. They have electric carpets that function like electric blankets. So if you sit on that carpet, it's not wall-to-wall carpet, it's a rug. Then you're nicely surrounded by radiant heat. They have electric gizmos that you can put in your bed at night to heat up your bed. You have to remember that in traditional Japanese houses and temples, you are not exposed to any external heat, except in the summer when it can be quite brutal. In the winter, it is quite miserable. And so it was at Hoshinji. Nakagawa Soen Roshi saw something in Kapleau that inspired him to take him up to Obama, Japan, to Hoshinji, where Harada Daiun Sokaku was the abbot and the Roshi. Nakagawa Soen Roshi was Rinzai. Harada Daiun Sokaku Roshi was nominally Soto. He was ordained as a Soto monk, but he did years and years of training in Rinzai monasteries, which is why we can teach koans in the traditional Rinzai way here at Mountain Gate. So diving in the deep pool without knowing how to swim, really, that first sesshin that Roshi Kapleau went to was a rohatsu. Obama's on the north side, and it gets cold winds over the water from Manchuria. I went to a rohatsu sesshin there. It was incredibly cold. And in fact, in order to go to the bathroom, which I had to do once in a while, I would have to jump up and down for about 5 minutes before I stripped off my robe, which was essential because the toilets were squat toilets, and then jump up and down some more as I was putting on my robe to go back to the zendo, just to generate enough internal heat that I wasn't devastated, basically. So back then also there were no chairs at Hoshinji because in that era, it was immediately post-war, people still lived in the traditional way, sitting on the floor. And he was allowed to go into the zendo, which is was a very positive thing and unusual for a foreigner. And the only way he could sit was cross-legged or seiza. And they did not even have seiza benches back then. They do now in Japan. They're called seiza isus, a zazen chair, basically. And they're tiny. Even though I'm not terribly tall, I did buy one, and I would end up basically sitting on my knees regardless, without any extra help. And I finally gave it away to somebody who was even smaller and thinner. So this is the atmosphere Roshi had when he entered Japan. But before that, he was born into a family of immigrants, actually. His mother and his father both immigrated separately from different countries, which no longer exist, actually, since the Second World War. One of them has been subsumed into Poland, and the other one, I don't know, but they're Eastern European countries, basically. And one of his fathers, or one of his parents, was Jewish, and the other parent was Catholic. And growing up, was apparently quite an adventure in his house. He had several siblings, including an older sister that the younger siblings referred to as the general. And one of his brothers was gay. He didn't have enough money. The family didn't have enough money to send anybody to college. So he learned to be a court reporter in this very archaic shorthand that they used back then. It was indecipherable to people who had learned Greg shorthand. And so he was able to write notes to himself in that shorthand, and nobody could read them. It was kind of handy. So he became rather well respected as a court reporter. He had his own business, and when the end of the war came, he was asked to go to Nuremberg for the war crimes trials there, and he was also asked then after that to go to Japan for those post-war criminal trials. I don't know which one of these he was at, where he was actually the head reporter. It doesn't matter so much. But what struck him in those days, post-war, was the difference in how the Germans responded, or actually reacted, in their case, to the accusations of genocide and all the war that they had basically started. And the Japanese reacted quite differently. They actually responded, apologizing, taking full responsibility. They'd been hoodwinked by the emperor at the time, and it was felt that, well, the war was interpreted as an attempt against the aggression of America. In Europe, of course, it was a different situation because there was the Holocaust and people were actively being killed. There was a serious genocide going on. And that puzzled him. Why did the Germans react in anger? And he used to call it, why me? Response. Whereas, as I said, the Japanese apologized. Now, of course, there's a sort of a backlash. There's been a backlash for some years in Japan, people trying to rewrite history and say that they were not responsible for a war. But anyway, we let them take care of that one. So he returned back to the United States after those times. And by the way, he used to spend his free hours in the gardens of the Zen temples in Kamakura. And he was struck too by the peace and the positive energy and the care that those gardens had been exposed to over centuries. And so, inspired by those two situations, he decided to learn more about Zen and started taking courses at Columbia University under D.T. Suzuki. At one point, and I'm sure that Roshi in those days was kind of full of himself, my understanding is that his fellow classmates, when he was pontificating about Zen, would say, okay, put up or shut up. So he decided to go to Japan. And there was another person that also went with him. And the two of them ended up going to Nakagawa Son Roshi's temple. And then, of course, what followed was the 3 months there, during which Son Roshi told him he couldn't come into the Zendo to practice But if he wanted to stay there, he had to do an hour of practice every day. Didn't matter when he did it. He was able to do it whenever he wanted to, but he had to do that. The experience at Hoshinji was a shock. Nakagawa Soen Roshi had a great community of friends who were artists, musicians, and this was right up Roshi Kapleau's alley, for he himself loved music and loved art. And on the way up to Obama on the train, he was just assuming that it would be a really nice time. He'd have tea with the two Roshis and discuss poetry and art. So it was kind of a rude awakening for him when he found himself suddenly in Rohatsu Sesshin, and a traditional Rohatsu Sesshin. He had an extremely difficult time with pain. Roshi Kapleau was not exactly an athlete, although athletes can also have their time with pain because their muscles can get quite tight if they don't stretch sufficiently. But just to pull himself into some form that would be acceptable in the Zendo there at Hoshinji was torture for him. And in fact, the last night, he actually fainted from the pain. He clearly gave himself fully to the sesshin. And so it was typical at Hoshinji back then, and also at Rochester later on, to pay special attention to people who were really focusing and really going deep. We don't use it here, the kyosaku, as it's called in Soto Zen, or the keisaku, as it's called in Rinzai Zen. It has not been effective, and if there is anyone in the Zendo who's been traumatized, it backfires, because it doesn't matter whether you're struck with the keisaku, like that, with this very long stick. Hearing the sound of it was enough to re-traumatize some people, so we quit using it quite a long time ago. Then we discovered there was another reason not to use it. A person who'd been long in Rochester and was in what they called the hot seat during sesshin, which is the one that got the most focus on the kyosaku treatment, came to his first sesshin at Mountain Gate and was horrified when we didn't use kyosaku. He had depended on it. He felt somehow deep that he couldn't actually practice without its instigation. So that was another reason to quit using it. Practice needs to be done by each person giving themselves to the practice. We cannot depend on anybody else or anything else to work. It has to be our own efforts. At the same time, so many people in the world seek escape from pain and suffering through drugs, alcohol, sex, parties, and so on. It doesn't work. The only way to work with pain and suffering is to go right into the energy of it, feeling it as fully as possible, which takes practice, especially when you get into something that has created anger. That's a really hard one, because we are so conditioned not to express anger that it's hard to allow ourselves to feel it. In my case, I was dead against feeling it because I did not want to be angry. And there were reasons for that in my life. So what I did was I stuffed it instead. And I wasn't aware that I was angry, but people could feel that energy all around me. Still, it took a long time of trying to work with it and a really gifted therapist to finally pry it loose so that I dared to feel it. And through that experience, recognize that I would not go out and punch somebody in the face or murder somebody, that if I felt it thoroughly as the energy that anger is, it was actually liberating. And not only liberating, it was exhilarating. So it's something for everybody to take a look at, really. Anger is pretty ubiquitous in the world. And these days, more and more and more and more. Politics has stirred up the pot considerably. And there are a lot of angry people in the United States and a lot of suffering people in the world. So after that sesshin, Roshi decided to stay at Hoshinji. Soen Roshi had translated for him because he could speak English, but Harada Roshi did not. And so another monk named Tangen, Harada Tangen, as a matter of fact, Harada is a very common word for last names in Japan, who spoke a little bit of English, very little, but had such a positive way of communicating without words that he kind of took Roshi under his wing and helped him through the ropes at Hoshinji and continued to be a real guardian angel for him. They remained deeply friendship throughout the rest of Roshi Kapleau's life. Tangen Roshi was younger, so he didn't die as early as Roshi Kapleau did, who was just short of his 92nd birthday. It turned out that Harada Daiyun Sokaku Roshi actually did yoga. And so Roshi Kapleau started doing yoga with Harada Daiyun Sokaku Roshi and gradually began to get more and more and more limber. And to the point where when he was in Rochester teaching, I never saw him sit any other position than full lotus without any pain whatsoever. Of course, he was quite skinny and he did yoga every day, but he could get into all these amazing positions and to demonstrate his flexibility. So if you're having challenges with posture and pain in your knees, back, wherever, try doing yoga on a regular basis. It can make a big difference. And any of you who do exercise like running or weights or whatever, it's important to seriously relax and seriously stretch after each encounter with the weights or the running shoes. You don't want to stretch before you do your activity. That's used to be said, but it's no longer considered appropriate. So by the time I knew him, as I said, he was completely flexible. When he first came to Rochester and started the Rochester Zen Center in the late 60s, after he had written 3 Pillars of Zen, a group of wealthy Rochester folks, including Chester Carlson, the inventor of Xerox, asked him to stay in Rochester and teach them Zen. it was kind of interesting to him that on Sunday mornings, nobody came to Zazen. He discovered later they were all in church, which is not a problem, but he was sort of surprised coming from such a dedicated environment in Japan at Hoshinji and within the country. Zen was still really big back then. It is not at all now. And in fact, I just learned recently that the only option for doing a Zen retreat in Japan is to do a Goenka retreat. Goenka was an Indian, East Indian, who was born and raised in Burma. In fact, he was alive when I was there, back in the early 1960s. He started doing Zazen when he was trying to deal with migraines. And someone had suggested that if he did Zazen, he would get rid of his migraines, which apparently he did. There was a Theravadan master, Mahasi Sayadaw, who is a really deep teacher in that Theravadan Zen tradition, or Theravadan Buddhist tradition. It's not Zen, but they do meditation. So in that sense, it's Zen, which means meditation. And he was so pleased with the results that he began teaching meditation retreats. He died quite a few years ago at this point, as you can imagine. And yet his format for doing retreats has continued on. It is actually, I think it was a Goenka retreat that is featured in a documentary on a prison in India, I think. It was an extremely notable prison because it was considered pretty awful. And so somebody decided to offer a meditation retreat to the prisoners if they would set it up and, do it. Apparently it was quite transformative. Anyway, Goenka's format is to sit for an hour with no moving, which was fine in Asia, but I think it would be pretty difficult in America. But there are Goenka retreats that you can go to in America. It's so interesting that while Zen in Japan is considered impossibly difficult, frightening, painful, beyond courage, and people are mostly not going to Zen retreats. Plus, there are very, very few places in Japan where you can actually go to an authentic Zen retreat. And the only one that I know of that accepts foreigners is Sogenji. So it's odd that there would be such a strenuous retreat. And apparently there's waiting lists to go to these retreats. I don't believe they existed in Japan when I was training at Sogenji, but certainly they are now, and I guess rather popular. So back to Roshi Kapleau. He came back to the United States and was with his fledgling little Zen community, but it was in the 60s when the hippies were in full bloom, and they started being drawn to Zen practice and started going to the Rochester Zen Center, at which point there was a crisis. And the older rich folks who had formed the community first said, it's either those stragglers, those unkempt kids, or us. And Roshi recognized that the kids, they were in their late teens, were actually quite serious about Zen practice. And yes, he had to institute some rules about no drugs. He had to insist that they actually build beds so they wouldn't be just hanging out on mats on the floor. But gradually they really, really took to the practice and got serious about it. The beds were made, of course. They mostly cut their hair. In fact, the women, inspired by Zen practitioners in Japan, wanted to shave their heads, but Roshi said no. You know, a shaven-headed woman in Rochester, New York would be anathema. And even still, at Tahoma Monastery, one day when Kyosan was the head monk there, the sheriff came up to have a chat because someone had, and he was ordained, and the men who are ordained either have shaved heads or they have extremely short hair, like 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch. And rumor had gone around about this group of basically, I think they were assumed to be white supremacists, sporting shaven heads. And the local folks were alarmed at that. Kyosan was probably the best person to deal with that. He was a prosecutor in one of the federal circuit courts in Southern California, used to dealing with people who were hard to deal with mafia folks. He once said to me, give me a man, and in 3 minutes, I can get a grown man to cry. He's not brutal. He's just very quiet and asks piercing questions. Anyway, he assuaged their concerns, and they didn't come up with that one again. There was also the funny thing that happened in Rochester, because Mu, of course, was a classic koan. In Zen, it has to do with a monk asking Joshu, a very highly regarded ancient Zen master in China, does even a dog have the Buddha nature? Apparently a monk had asked him because dogs were certainly at that time considered pretty wretched animals. Nothing anyone would want to have in their house. And so this guy obviously had an idea about the Buddha nature inhabiting only people who were important and upright, I guess. And how could a dog possibly have the Buddha nature, wretched as it was? Obviously, the guy did not understand the nature of Buddha nature. And Joshu answered Mu, which means not or no in Chinese, and also in Japanese, by the way. And yet at another time, a different monk asked the same question, and he said, I think it was Wu, which means yes. Now, Joshu was a very highly regarded master with long, long years of intensive Zen training. So how do you compute that? Same question, he answers no to one monk and yes to another. So what is this? What does this Mu stand for, really? So lots of people were on the Koan Mu at Rochester, which is in a very residential district. It's actually quite old. In fact, one of the two buildings that is the Rochester Zen Center, actually two of the three buildings, that is the Rochester Zen Center, are actually, they could be on the list of historic buildings. One is an exquisitely beautiful house. These are all Victorian. In fact, I think it was late 1800s that it was built, and the person that built it was a lumber baron. And so the place is full of beautiful carvings of oak. We decided not to put it on the National Register because it would mean that any repairs we had to do to the building had to be authentic and actually of the native materials that they were originally built with. And that was going to be too expensive for us because we had to replace the slate roof on one of them, and we simply couldn't afford to replace the slate roof with slate. At any rate, these kids were accepted, and the other folks basically left, except for one. And he kind of hung around for, two actually. They kind of hung around for a long, long time. And in fact, Ralph Chapin was one of them. He had actually read the proofs of the 3 Pillars of Zen in Roshi Kapleau's living room in Kamakura, and arranged to have them printed and published in the United States. He was quite wealthy, and in fact, when he died, he deeded his property, called Chapin Mill, which became the country property for the Rochester Zen Center. It's 162 acres or something like that. Beautiful, beautiful landscapes. And there's actually a mill pond, which, by the way, is full of leeches, and a mill wheel, and an old stone house, and a barn, and a few other buildings. So that has become Rochester's Chapin Mill Retreat Center. The other person was a woman who was only in her early 40s when the other folks had decided to abandon Rochester. And she stayed until she died, in her 90s, actually. But the Zen Center grew with these young folks. Roshi's teaching in those days was challenging for a lot of people. After all, he was a Leo, so he was pretty upfront about himself. However, one of the things that I was so impressed by in the almost 40 years that I knew him, 20 of which I trained with him intensively and was his secretary attendant for many different times. A year in Santa Fe when he retired, several months, twice in Mexico, 2 years running. When he would go down there, one of which was to write the book. It was the replacement for The Wheel of Death. And I think its title was eventually changed by the publisher. He changed. His practice, I realize now, must have gone very deep, because one of the things that happens if we don't brush it aside, as we go deep, we begin to get insights into the truth of our behavior. And it's easy to bail on that. In fact, there was a psychologist who was actually also a Buddhist practitioner, I think Zen, for 30 years at least, John Welwood, who wrote a couple of books on the propensity for people to what he called make an end run around their issues with the practice. You can focus so much on that mu koan in particular. And the instructions, the traditional instructions from Japan were always just mu, just mu, just mu. And anything else was brushed aside. You just didn't deal with it until you'd had a full awakening experience. And that theoretically, according to the sense of it in Japan, was that doing that practice so narrowly would automatically take care of any issues you had. Of course, the Japanese culture is very different. But even there, and so much more so in the West, we have real issues if we try to narrow our focus just to that one word and knock everything else out of the picture. So if something comes up for you and it's strong, particularly if it's an insight into your behavior, turn and experience how it feels in your body. The regret, the disappointment, the pain of suddenly realizing how you've been acting, the tone of voice you've been using without even realizing it to people. In that way, you can become truly free. And obviously he did that. He didn't particularly teach it that way, but he himself did practice in that way. And over the decades I was with him, I could see that he, as soon as he realized something about himself that was not enlightened, that was not appropriate behavior, it was gone. He had this gift for opening up to it, feeling it, and in that process, letting it go 100%. It was really impressive. That is one of the things I noted most about training with him, and I saw it over the years unfolding again and again and again. There are other people who were his students who would get irritated by something he did or said, and 30 years later, we're still chewing on that one, angry still, having not moved on. It's a sad thing because Zen practice is truly transformative when we allow it to be. And that's what he did. He allowed it to be. And over the years, his teaching shifted and became more gentle, more compassionate. There was a period where, just like his generation, he poo-pooed psychotherapy. My father, who was born a year before he was, also felt the same. But some of his students began to go to do psychotherapy on the side, and he began to realize how it was changing them in a positive ways and how it was enhancing their practice. And so he did a complete turnaround and was accepting that in addition to practice as something that was beneficial to people. He ended up, towards the end of his life, actually towards his last 2 decades of his life, with Parkinson's. At first, it was not particularly noticeable until one time when I was down in Mexico with him for a long term, and we had rented a house that had an upstairs accessed by an outdoor stairway that was brick, and a downstairs where his two attendants lived, myself and another Mexican woman who did the cooking and that kind of thing. And we had just gone to the local sangha in Mexico City, and he had done a remarriage ceremony for a couple of couples, and it was spring, and the Manila mangoes were just starting to come on the market. So the group gave him a whole plate of those incredibly wonderful mangoes. They're the best mangoes I've ever had. And I've had mangoes all over the world. Well, not all over the world. Mexico and Southeast Asia. And so he had taken them upstairs to his room, and then he decided to bring them back down. And I was in my room, and I heard this crash, tinkle, tinkle, and silence. I guess that left leg that he was dragging only imperceptibly, just not lifting as high as the other, had caught on the unsmooth surface of the bricks, and he had fallen all the way down to the landing. He was in pretty bad shock. And I was the only one there at the time. And so I managed to get him into the car and take him to the local clinic. Now, his history has been a challenging one medically. When he was still living in Santa Fe, he had surgery for a prostate. And they gave him a traditional suppository that is normally given to reduce pain in prostate surgery. And he had a cardiac arrest. No, it wasn't cardiac arrest, it was a respiratory arrest. And so we knew already that he had a high sensitivity to medication. So when we went to the local clinic, it was run by an intern who, in fact, I'm not sure he was even that. I think he was a medical student. And the clinic was a very basic clinic. It had no X-ray equipment. So the doctor offered to give him pain medication. We looked at it carefully. Roshi decided to take it, and the young doctor took us to a local clinic run by an actual doctor who actually had X-ray machines. No, he didn't. He had enough way of deciphering injuries that he could. He nailed it that Roshi had broken his elbow and his wrist. It broke the edge, the point off his elbow, and his wrist was broken in multiple places. Roshi was a magnet for broken bones, by the way. I'm sure he had osteoporosis. So this man hooked him up to to something that would give him, I think he was just trying to take him out of shock. And we drove to Cuernavaca, with the doctor in the back seat, Roshi lying down, and the doctor holding up the bottle so that it could go into his veins. We got to Gerardo Gali's home because there were no telephones back then, and certainly no cell phones. And I knew I had to get in touch with Gerardo. He was the leader of the local group. So we went there, and the doctor wanted to take us to the Red Cross hospital. So we alerted Gerardo to that, and he was going to appear the next morning. And so we went on to the hospital. It was Sunday night by that time at midnight. And they decided to try x-raying him, but they wouldn't let me in there. And within seconds, they came running out and said, we're not going to do anything further until tomorrow morning when the full staff is here. He'd had another arrest. I don't know whether it was cardiac or, I think it was cardiac actually. And so we stayed the night. I slept in his room. Another student actually slept on the floor outside the door because we didn't want anybody coming in and offering anything more than an aspirin because of his sensitivity to drugs. So in the morning, Gerardo came and paid for the overnight with a credit card. And by that time, he had alerted a Sangha doctor who arranged for Roshi to be taken to the Humana Hospital in Mexico City, where there were English-speaking doctors. And goodness, we had a rooftop, a penthouse room. It overlooked the whole city. It was amazing. It was huge. And there was a chair that would fold out so I could stay there. And he was interviewed for 45 minutes by the anesthesiologist in English about his exploits with medications. And they went ahead and did surgery, put him all kinds of bolts and nuts and screws into his wrists and his elbow to kind of put him back together again, Humpty Dumpty. And we stayed there for several days, several more days. Then we went back to New Mexico. By then he was living in New Mexico. And lo and behold, 6 months later, he was out jogging with his little dog. And the dog ran between his legs. He tripped and fell and broke the upper arm that he'd broken. So we've had a lot of experience taking Roshi to hospitals and doctors. It was my first experience with a doctor's office in Santa Fe, where the receptionist was a 45, 50-year-old woman. It was Halloween, and she had dyed her hair a brilliant purple. They celebrate Halloween pretty enthusiastically in Santa Fe. So he lived in Santa Fe for a year, and the Sangha kind of gathered around, but most of us, except for 3 of us, were sort of not super enthusiastic. In fact, at the party that welcomed Roshi on the way up to the ski basin in one of the places you can give parties out there in the beautiful views on the mountain. And one person stood up in the middle of the party and said, "Roshi, we're so happy to have you here. We really want you to be here, but we don't want you to tell us what to do." So he just listened. I don't think anything could nonplus him by that time. And we stayed. Every Sunday night he would have movie night, often with the classic movies like Nenochka, black and white movies. Almost nobody came. Sunday mornings he would give a teisho and doksan. But when the group, some of us wanted to sit more than 2 nights a week, wanted a third night, one of the people in the group said, nope. And it had been set up by somebody else that we had to have a full consensus before anything could happen, which was sad. So when another one of his students, whose wife was a physical therapist, by the way, said, come down to Florida, Roshi. Come down to South Florida. We'll take care of you. Roshi had thought it was going to be nice and warm in Santa Fe, and was shocked that it wasn't. So he was very happy both to leave a place that really wasn't very enthusiastic about Zen practice, and to go somewhere where it was warmer, and he had people to really take care of him. By then, his Parkinson's was worse and worse. It was finally figured out that he had Parkinson's. And he eventually ended up in a wheelchair much, much later, and back in Rochester because it became too expensive to try to take care of him down in Mexico in that condition. By that time, when he returned to Rochester, he'd been on medication for Parkinson's for close to 20 years and was having some pretty significant tardive dyskinesia, which is where it's a side effect of some medications where you have uncontrollable movements in your body. One of is spontaneously sticking out your tongue, which makes it very interesting to be in the presence of your Zen master and he's sticking out his tongue at you. The other thing that happened was he had no control over his arms. They would just wave like this, madly, sometimes knocking off his glasses. His voice got very, very soft, and they tried to get a piece of equipment that would magnify it, but he didn't like it because it sounded so mechanical. And at one point, I finally said to him when I was visiting, I said, Roshi, this Parkinson's is really a teacher, isn't it? He said, yes. He dealt with it through utter presence, never a complaint, just that became his practice. He could no longer be in the Zendo and do Zazen in that format. And he was by then in a wheelchair because he had fallen so frequently that we insisted that he not walk around. So it was that a few years later, just short of his 92nd birthday, he was dying. His doctor was a hospice doctor who specialized in working with people who were dying and was there in presence. His Sangha was there, his daughter was there. It was a beautiful sunny day, and he was there in his wheelchair as he was slowly fading away. And at some point, he just simply didn't breathe again. It was seamless. No struggle, no anxiety. And the doctor was so impressed, he wrote about it in a book. This is what brought me to Zen practice. Reading that early volume, The Wheel of Death, 4 short chapters, Zen, birth, rebirth, no, what was it? Birth, death, reincarnation. There was another one. Anyway, the book's long out of print. But there were stories of Socrates dying. There were stories of monks and Zen masters dying just without any sign of any concern or struggle. And in fact, Socrates apparently said something about, why are you, his students were around him, why are you sobbing? How do you know this isn't going to be the most amazing experience I will have in my life? How do you know that death is terrible? And those Zen masters, along with Socrates, made me wonder what they knew that I didn't, because I was terrified of death back then. And that's what catapulted me into Zen practice. That's part of what did. To be able to live and die without fear, but with clarity and the freedom that is offered by deep, long-term Zen practice. It's something that has been experienced by people in many of the religions of the world. It's not limited to Zen, but mostly in the rest of them, the path to that depth has been lost. It's there for Sufis in the Islamic tradition. It's there for some Christians who want to go that deep. But in Zen practice, Rinzai Zen practice in particular, one can experience total liberation. That's what Zen is about. At Roshi's 90th birthday, his students, senior students, actually his Dharma successors, were asked to say 3 things about him. One of the things I said to him was, Roshi, you believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. He wasn't soupy about it. He just was honoring. Didn't complain about me, didn't criticize me. The only thing that ever happened in all those years was that in my exuberance, one day I was running up the stairs in 5AP, the historic house, and he was coming down this narrow stairway, and he kind of gave me a look, which was to communicate that I was not really behaving in the proper Zen way. Back then, we had to keep our eyes down, not communicate any more than necessary, and wear dark clothing. The other thing I said, or one of the other things I said, I don't remember what the middle one was, the third one, but I said, you clearly worked on yourself so seriously when you saw that you were caught in some level of dysfunction. Instantly it was gone. It was an incredible model for me, and I think for many other people. So in the years since I was training with him, I realized, increasingly so, what an incredible teacher he was. How he was so supportive without being obviously supportive. How he was so compassionate without being soupy, as I said. How he demanded the deepest response from us in Doksan. And through that teaching, enabled so many people to come to awakening. I owe an awful lot to that man, and I'm still so impressed by how little he felt about himself. He was just let go. He was humble. Of course, in the beginning of his teaching, it was not quite that much, but by the time I had worked with him for so long, I saw the process of letting go, letting go, letting go. Clarity increasing, a gift for teaching. So thank you, Roshi. And the fact that his lineage has carried down, it's in the second generation now. Recently I learned of the transmission to a British guy by the teachers at the Swedish Sangha. And curiously enough, his Buddhist name is Mitra, which is kind of interesting. Mitra means spiritual friend. And being British, he probably heard of the term Kalyana Mitra, which is used in at least one of the Zen centers there as a spiritual friend. So I leave you with this, and I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows. Shujo muhen segando bono mujin segandan homon muryo segan gaku butsudo mujo seganjo shujo muhen segando bono mujin segandan homon muryo segan gaku butsudo mujo seganjo shujo muhen segando bono mujin segandan homon muryo segan gaku butsudo mujo seganjo. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them. Clinging is inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to it. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to master them. The way of liberation is unsurpassable. I vow to become it. So obviously I've gone way over, but it was important today to share that information about Roshi. And now we'll have to temporarily end the Zoom so we can get the recording. We'll be back up momentarily. Thank you.